Michele weaved through the crowded streets like a ghost, unnoticed among the throngs of people rushing by. She clutched the basket of flowers tightly, her thin arms aching from the weight. But it wasn't the flowers that pressed on her so heavily, it was the crushing responsibility that came with them. Every sale meant one more step toward keeping her mother, Margaret, alive. The image of her mother lying pale and fragile on their old mattress haunted her thoughts. Michele knew the medical bills were piling up, and with every shallow breath her mother took, she felt the ticking of time slipping away. Yet, she never let Margaret see her fear. When her mother asked how things were going, Michele would smile, hiding the exhaustion behind her bright blue eyes. "It's going well, Mom. Don't worry." Those were the words Michele repeated every night. She never mentioned the late hours she spent walking the streets or the blisters on her feet. It was a burden she carried alone, with a kind of silent resilience children sometimes show when the world weighs too heavily on them. That day, as Michele stood on the sidewalk, scanning the crowd with hopeful eyes, her voice was soft but persistent. "Roses. Fresh roses. $10 a bouquet." Most people brushed past her without even a glance. A few gave her sympathetic smiles but didn't stop. It had been a slow morning. Every minute that passed without a sale gnawed at her nerves. She gripped the basket tighter, determined not to give up, even as the fatigue settled into her bones. Then, through the blur of hurrying bodies, a man stood still. He was different, tall, well-dressed, and not in the impatient way many others seemed to be. His suit was neatly pressed, dark gray with subtle pinstripes. His presence radiated a calmness that made him stand out from the restless crowd. Michele felt his gaze linger on her before he stepped forward and looked into her basket. Without urgency, he picked up a bouquet of red roses. The flowers looked fragile in his large hands. His green eyes met Michele's with a kindness she wasn't used to seeing. "How much for these?" he asked, his voice smooth but low, as if he had all the time in the world. Michele straightened her back, forcing herself to sound professional despite the nervous flutter in her chest. $10, sir," she said quickly. The man gave a small warm smile. He didn't haggle, didn't ask for change. Instead, he pulled out his wallet and handed her a crisp $10 bill. Michele felt a mixture of relief and gratitude as she took the money, but before she could say thank you, the man spoke again. His next question made her heart skip. "Do you sell flowers here every day? Alone?" There was no hint of judgment in his voice, just genuine curiosity. Michele hesitated, unsure of how much she should share. She was used to keeping her struggles to herself. Most people didn't care, and those who did often treated her like a charity case. But there was something different about this man. She lowered her gaze, tracing a pattern on the edge of the basket with her thumb. "Yes. I have to," she admitted softly. "My mom is sick. I need to help pay for her treatment." The man's expression shifted, his smile faltered, and a flicker of something else crossed his face. Understanding, perhaps. Or maybe empathy. Whatever it was, Michele felt seen in a way that was both comforting and unsettling. She wasn't used to anyone caring. The man gave her a small nod, as if he knew what it was like to carry a burden bigger than yourself. "Take care of yourself, okay?" he said gently, before turning back toward the busy street. Michele watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the sea of strangers. For a moment, she stood frozen, clutching the $10 bill in her hand. Then she tucked it carefully into the small pouch tied around her waist and straightened her shoulders. One bouquet sold, many more to go. But she felt a strange warmth, knowing that someone, if only briefly, had truly noticed her. Over the next few days, the man returned. Michele began to expect him, though she never admitted it to herself. He came at different times, always buying a bouquet, always chatting with her for a few moments. His name was Michael, she learned. He told her little about himself, but enough for Michele to realize he was successful in a way that made life seem effortless for him. Yet, there was something else, something quiet and heavy behind his easy smile. A loneliness, perhaps. Or regrets he wasn't ready to share. Michele felt herself opening up more with each meeting. Michael never pressed her, but his presence became a small source of comfort in her otherwise difficult days. She even caught herself smiling sometimes, forgetting, just for a moment, the weight she carried. But they weren't the only ones paying attention. In the shadows of the city, a man named Victor watched. He had been following Michael for weeks, biding his time. Victor was once Michael's business partner, until greed got the best of him. When his schemes were uncovered, Michael had turned him in, leaving Victor disgraced, bankrupt, and filled with seething resentment. Now, Victor was a man with nothing to lose, and nothing drove him more than the desire to see Michael suffer. Watching Michael and the girl, Victor saw an opportunity. Michele was young and vulnerable, an easy target. And Michael? Well, Michael had finally found something, or someone, to care about. That made him weak. Victor's lips curled into a grin as a plan began to form in his mind. This wasn't just going to be revenge. This was going to be personal. Michele's fingers trembled as she pushed the front door open. Something was off. The door wasn't just unlocked, it was slightly ajar, as if someone had left in a hurry or never intended to close it properly. She stepped inside cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. The dim light in the small living room flickered, casting uneven shadows on the walls. The air was heavy, laced with the scent of dust and overturned objects. Her eyes darted across the room, noting the overturned chair, the drawer left half open, and the broken vase near the entrance. Her heart sank. Mom," she called out, her voice cracking as it echoed back to her. No answer. Michele swallowed hard and moved further into the apartment, the soles of her shoes scraping against the cluttered floor. She stopped in the doorway of her mother's bedroom. The sight before her made her breath catch in her throat. The bed was a mess, sheets thrown to the floor, pillows tossed aside, and the blanket bundled in a heap as if someone had yanked it off in a struggle. Her mother was gone. Panic surged through her. Michele stepped closer, her hands clutching the doorframe, willing herself to find something, anything, that would tell her where her mother had gone. But the room was empty. The silence was suffocating. She checked the tiny kitchen and the bathroom, her heart thudding louder with every passing second. No sign of her mother anywhere. Tears welled in her eyes as the horrifying possibilities flooded her mind. Maybe her mother had fallen ill and someone had taken her to the hospital? Maybe she had gone to get help? But the door left open and the way the room had been ransacked told a different story. Something was very wrong. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She spun around, her eyes searching wildly for anything, any clue, any sign of where her mother might be. But there was nothing except the gnawing emptiness filling every corner of the apartment. With her hands trembling, Michele stumbled out of the house and onto the street. The night felt vast and indifferent, swallowing her small frame as she looked around desperately. People walked by, unaware of the storm raging inside her. She wiped at her eyes, but the tears kept coming. She was alone. Suddenly, she heard the screech of tires as a car came to a halt just a few feet away. Michele flinched, startled, and turned toward the sound. It was Michael's car. He jumped out without hesitation, his expression shifting the moment he saw her standing there, lost and panicked. "Michele," he called out, rushing over to her. "What happened?" She tried to speak, but the words got tangled in her throat. Sobs broke free instead. Michael crouched down to her level, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. Hey, he said softly, trying to meet her gaze. "Take a breath. What's going on?" "My mom," Michele gasped, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's gone. She's not home. I don't know where she is." Michael's face tightened, but not with fear, there was resolve in his expression. He glanced toward the dimly lit doorway of her apartment, as if piecing things together. "Was the door open?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. Michele nodded frantically. "The house is a mess. It looks like someone broke in." Michael's jaw clenched. He gave her shoulder a reassuring squeeze and nodded firmly. "We're going to find her," he said with a certainty that Michele clung to like a lifeline. "But first, we need to go to the police." Before she could respond, Michael guided her gently toward the car. Michele climbed into the passenger seat, still shaking, her mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. Michael slid into the driver's seat, his movements calm and deliberate. As they drove through the quiet streets, Michele stared out the window, trying to suppress the gnawing fear in her chest. She wanted to believe Michael's words, wanted to believe that everything would be okay, but the weight of the unknown was suffocating. At the police station, Michael stood by her side as they filed the report. Michele tried to describe everything clearly, but the words kept catching in her throat. The officer behind the desk asked her the same questions in different ways. When was the last time you saw your mother? Was anything missing from the house? Was there any sign of forced entry? Michele answered as best as she could, clutching her arms tightly around herself as if that would hold her together. Michael took over when her voice faltered, his presence calm but insistent. "We need someone looking into this right away," he told the officer. "She's sick. She can't just disappear." The officer nodded, making notes on a clipboard, but his detached demeanor did little to ease Michelle's fear. After what felt like hours, the paperwork was finally done, and the officer assured them that a patrol unit would visit the apartment. It wasn't much, but it was all they had for now. Back outside, the night air felt colder than before. Michele stood still on the sidewalk, her arms wrapped tightly around her body, staring at nothing in particular. She didn't know what to do next. Everything she had counted on, her routine, her small but important role in keeping her mother safe, had shattered in a single moment. Michael watched her carefully, sensing her hesitation. "You can't stay there tonight," he said gently. "Come with me. Just for now. We'll figure things out in the morning." Michele opened her mouth to protest, but the words never came. She knew he was right. There was no way she could go back to that empty apartment alone. And despite the fear clawing at her, there was something reassuring about Michael's steady presence. "Okay," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael gave her a small nod and opened the car door for her again. The drive to his apartment was quiet, the kind of silence that isn't uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken thoughts. Michele leaned her head against the window, her mind drifting to her mother, wondering where she was, if she was hurt, if she was scared. When they arrived at Michael's place, Michele hesitated for a moment in the doorway. His apartment was spacious and meticulously neat, far from the cluttered warmth of the home she shared with her mother. It felt strange to step into a place that seemed so perfect, yet so lifeless. "You can have the guest room," Michael said, flicking on the lights. "It's just down the hall." Michele followed him, feeling awkward and out of place. The guest room was large, with a soft bed that looked untouched. It was bigger than any bed she had ever slept in. Michael lingered in the doorway, watching her with quiet concern. "If you need anything, I'll be in the other room," he said softly. "Try to get some rest, okay?" Michele nodded, though rest felt like an impossible task. Her mind was still racing, the fear gnawing at her from the inside. But she was too exhausted to argue. She slipped off her shoes and climbed into the bed, the mattress soft beneath her aching body. For a moment, as she pulled the blanket around herself, she allowed a small spark of hope to flicker in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she thought. Michael closed the door quietly behind him, leaving Michele alone in the dim room. She lay still, staring at the ceiling, her mind too tired to think but too restless to sleep. Somewhere out there, her mother was waiting, and Michele would do whatever it took to find her. Michael was sitting at his desk, lost in thought, when his phone buzzed, cutting through the silence. The number on the screen was unknown, but he answered without hesitation, already sensing the darkness that awaited on the other end. "Michael," the voice said, smooth but venomous. The sound was like a knife twisting in his gut. He recognized it instantly. "Victor." "I have the woman," Victor continued, his tone cold and deliberate. "If you want her alive, you'll pay what you owe me." Michael's hand tightened around the phone, the muscles in his jaw clenching. He knew exactly what this was, not just a ransom but a trap. Victor wasn't interested in money alone. This was about humiliation, about revenge. And now, Margaret's life hung in the balance. Michael leaned forward in his chair, his mind racing. He kept his voice calm, though the fury simmered beneath the surface. "Victor, don't do this. This has nothing to do with her." "On the contrary," Victor replied with a smug chuckle. "This has everything to do with her. You took everything from me, Michael. Now I'll take something from you." Michael closed his eyes for a brief second, willing himself to stay composed. He knew Victor wouldn't give Margaret up easily, even if the ransom was paid. This wasn't a negotiation, it was a game, and Victor held all the cards. "Where and when?" Michael asked flatly, cutting through the pretense. Victor chuckled again. "I knew you'd see reason. I'll be in touch with the details soon. And Michael, don't even think about involving the police. If I see one badge, it's over for her." The line went dead, leaving Michael gripping the phone in silence. He placed it down slowly, his mind already working through possible plans. He knew paying the ransom wouldn't be the end. Victor would destroy Margaret anyway, just to make Michael suffer. From the corner of the room, Michele had been standing quietly listening. Michael hadn't noticed her at first, but now her presence became unavoidable. She stepped closer, her small frame rigid with tension. "Was that about my mom?" she asked, her voice soft but edged with fear. Michael glanced at her, conflicted. Yes, he admitted after a brief pause. Victor has her. He wants something from me in exchange. Michelle's fists clenched at her sides. Then we have to do something, she said quickly, her voice rising with determination. We can't just wait. Michael shook his head. This is dangerous, Michele. It's not as simple as paying him and getting her back. I don't care, Michele shot back, her blue eyes blazing. We have to try. I need to help. Her words hit Michael harder than he expected. He knew she was just a kid, but the look in her eyes reminded him of someone much older, someone who had already lost too much and refused to lose anything more. He knelt down to her level, choosing his next words carefully. I understand how you feel, but this isn't a fight you can win on your own. Victor isn't someone you can reason with. Michelle's voice didn't waver. I'm not asking to do it alone. I want to help you. Please, Michael. For a moment, Michael said nothing. He saw the determination in her face, and something stirred in him, an understanding maybe, or a recognition of his own desperation reflected in hers. She wasn't going to sit back and do nothing, and Michael knew that if he tried to stop her, it would only make things worse. Okay, he said finally, his voice low but firm. We'll do this together. But you have to follow my lead. No risks unless I say so. Deal. Michele nodded quickly, relief flashing across her face. Deal. Michael stood up and ran a hand through his hair, already thinking 3 steps ahead. They didn't have much time. Victor would call soon, and the clock was ticking. First, we need a plan, Michael muttered, half to himself. He knew that whatever they did had to be precise. There was no room for error. Michele followed him as he paced the room, her mind racing alongside his. She wasn't going to be a bystander in this fight, not when her mother's life was on the line. Victor thinks he has all the power, Michael continued, almost to himself. We need to make him believe he's won, right up until the moment he loses everything. How? Michele asked, her voice steady now. Michael glanced at her, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. She wasn't just a scared kid anymore, she was determined, ready to fight for her mother. With the police, Michael said slowly, but not the way he expects. Michele tilted her head, waiting for him to explain. We'll set up the meeting exactly how Victor wants, Michael said, his mind working through the details. But the police will be there, waiting in the shadows. Victor won't know what hit him. Michelle's lips tightened, a mixture of fear and hope swelling inside her. And if something goes wrong? Michael's expression darkened. It won't. It can't. He knew the stakes were too high for mistakes. If they failed, Margaret would pay the price, and so would Michele. Go get some rest, Michael said quietly, though he knew rest would be impossible for either of them. We'll need to be ready when Victor calls again. Michele didn't argue. She gave a small nod and headed toward the guest room, though her heart remained heavy with worry. As she disappeared down the hallway, Michael stood alone in the dim light of his apartment. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number of a trusted police officer, a man who owed him a favor. He hesitated for a moment, then pressed call. This is Michael. I need your help. The abandoned warehouse loomed ahead, its crumbling walls and shattered windows giving the place an air of menace. Michael tightened his grip on the steering wheel as he parked the car just outside, his jaw set. Beside him, Michele sat silently, her small hands gripping the edges of her seat. In the back, the black leather briefcase lay flat, packed with neatly bundled cash, every bill counterfeit. It was the key to their plan, and with luck, it would buy them enough time to get Margaret out safely. Stay close to me, and don't do anything unless I say, Michael said, breaking the silence. Michele gave a small nod, though her heart was racing in her chest. She wasn't scared of Victor, she was terrified of failing, of losing her mother. Michael scanned the area before pushing open the car door. The two stepped out, and their shoes crunched on the gravel. From somewhere beyond the rusted walls, unseen officers waited, ready to close in. But they had to play this perfectly. Victor wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger if he sensed anything was off. They approached the entrance. The heavy metal door groaned as Michael pulled it open, and the dim light inside revealed the shadowy corners of the warehouse. The air smelled of rust and decay. At the far end of the room, a figure emerged from the darkness, Victor. And he wasn't alone. Victor's hand gripped Margaret's arm tightly, dragging her forward. She stumbled, weak and pale, her breathing shallow, but her eyes immediately locked onto Michele. Michele, Margaret's voice was barely a whisper, but the relief was unmistakable. She gave the smallest smile, a fragile gesture that Michele wanted to run toward and wrap herself in. Michele bit her lip, forcing herself to stay still. Michael's warning rang in her head. This wasn't the moment to act. They had to wait for the right time. One wrong move, and everything would fall apart. Victor stopped a few feet away, his face twisted in a grin that dripped with malice. His eyes flicked between Michael and Michele, savoring the moment. "So you actually showed up," Victor said, his voice thick with amusement. "And you brought the kid with you. Gutsy move." Michele's jaw clenched, but Michael remained calm, his expression unreadable. "Let them go, Victor," Michael said evenly. "This ends with us. Leave them out of it." Victor chuckled, clearly enjoying the power he held. He gave Margaret's arm a rough tug, making her wince. "Oh, Michael," Victor sneered. "Always the hero. But we both know this isn't just between us anymore. You cared enough to get involved with them, and now here we are." Michael stayed silent, watching Victor carefully. Every move, every word, was calculated. He knew Victor fed off control, off the fear he instilled. The briefcase at Michael's side was their only leverage now, and he needed Victor focused on it, not on Margaret or Michele. Victor's grin widened as he caught sight of the briefcase. "That's what I like to see. I assume that's my money." Michael slowly lifted the case, holding it out slightly. As agreed. Victor's eyes glittered with satisfaction. "Set it down, and we'll see about the girl and her mother." Michael lowered the case onto the ground, the metallic snap of the latch audible in the eerie stillness. He straightened slowly, keeping his gaze locked on Victor's every move. Margaret let out a shaky breath, her knees buckling slightly, but Victor yanked her upright with a vicious pull. Michele's heart pounded in her chest as she watched, her fists clenched so tightly her nails bit into her palms. She wanted to scream, to tear her mother away from him, but she knew better. Victor's grip tightened on Margaret, his grin never wavering. "You always thought you were better than me, Michael. But look at you now. Desperate, just like the rest of us." Michael's voice was low but steady. "Let them go. You got what you wanted." Victor tilted his head, pretending to consider the offer. Maybe. His hand moved toward his jacket, and in one fluid motion, he pulled out a gun. The room seemed to shrink as the weight of the moment sank in. Michele's breath hitched, and Margaret flinched as the cold metal gleamed under the dim light. Michael's body tensed, but he kept his voice calm. "Victor, don't." Victor's smile widened. "What? Afraid I'll ruin your little happy ending?" His eyes flicked toward Michele with a mocking grin. "She looks like she still believes in those." Michele glared at him, anger burning in her chest. "You won't win," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the fear thrumming inside her. Victor chuckled darkly, turning the gun slightly in her direction, just enough to make her flinch. Such spirit. Shame it won't matter. Then from the distance, the faint sound of sirens began to rise, cutting through the tension like a blade. Victor's smile faltered, his gaze shifting toward the entrance. Michael's heart leapt. The police. "They're here, Victor's grin twisted into a snarl. "You called the cops." The gun twitched in his hand, and for a terrifying second, everything hung in the balance. The sirens blared louder, echoing through the warehouse walls, growing closer with every second. Red and blue lights flickered through the cracked windows, casting distorted shadows along the walls. Victor's head snapped toward the entrance, his smug expression vanishing as the reality of the situation sank in. His eyes narrowed, filled with fury and disbelief. "You son of a..." Victor spun around, yanking Margaret closer, his hand tightening around her arm like a vice. Panic flashed across her face as she stumbled forward, her strength nearly gone. Michele took a step toward her mother, but Michael shot out a hand, holding her back. "Stay still," Michael hissed under his breath, his voice sharp but calm. Michele froze, her heart pounding so hard it hurt. Victor knew he had only seconds before the police stormed the building. Desperation twisted his features as he looked around wildly, the gun twitching in his grip. He was calculating, weighing his options, but Michael could see it in his eyes. Victor was about to bolt. "I told you," Victor growled, pulling Margaret closer, using her as a shield. "I warned you what would happen if you involved the cops." His voice dripped with venom, every word trembling with rage. "You're done, Victor," Michael said, taking a step forward. There's no way out. Victor shook his head violently, his face contorted with fury. I'll find a way. I always do. And then he moved. Victor shoved Margaret to the ground and darted toward the back of the warehouse, the gun still clutched in his hand. Margaret cried out as she hit the cold concrete floor, curling in on herself as if bracing for the worst. "Mom." Michele screamed, starting toward her. Michael didn't hesitate. "Michele, stay with your mother," he barked over his shoulder before taking off after Victor. Victor sprinted toward the nearest exit, his boots slamming against the floor in rapid, uneven steps. Michael was right behind him, his legs burning as he pushed forward, determined not to let Victor slip away. If Victor escaped now, everything they'd done, every risk they'd taken, would be for nothing. Victor reached the exit door and slammed his shoulder into it. But as soon as he pushed through, 2 police officers tackled him to the ground. "Get off me!" Victor roared, thrashing wildly, the gun skidding across the floor with a metallic clang. The officers pinned him down, their movements swift and practiced, twisting his arms behind his back. "You think this ends here?" Victor shouted, his voice hoarse with rage. "This isn't over. Do you hear me? I'll come for you, Michael. You and the girl. I'll—" The cold click of handcuffs silenced him. The officers hauled him to his feet, one of them grabbing him firmly by the back of the neck as they led him away. Victor struggled, still hurling curses and threats into the air, but no one listened. His reign of terror was over. Michael stood at the entrance, his chest heaving, watching as the officers forced Victor into the back of a squad car. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the night. He let out a long, slow breath, wiping the sweat from his brow before turning back toward the warehouse. Inside, Michele was already on her knees beside Margaret, wrapping her arms tightly around her mother's frail body. Margaret was crying softly, her shoulders shaking as she held her daughter as if afraid to ever let go again. "I thought I lost you," Michele whispered, her voice breaking. Margaret kissed the top of her daughter's head, her hands trembling as they stroked Michelle's hair. "I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'll never leave you again." Michael approached quietly, standing a few feet away as the two embraced. Margaret looked up, her eyes swollen with tears but filled with gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Michael gave her a small, tired smile. "You're safe now," he said, his voice gentle. Michele glanced over her shoulder at Michael, her blue eyes still shining with tears. "You saved us," she said softly, awe and gratitude lacing every word. Michael shook his head slightly. "You saved yourselves," he replied. "I just did what I had to." Margaret tried to sit up, but her body wavered with exhaustion. Michael crouched down beside them, gently offering his arm to help her. "Easy," he said. "You've been through enough. Let's get you out of here." Margaret nodded weakly, leaning on him for support. Michele clung to her mother's side, unwilling to let go even for a second. Together, they made their way toward the exit. In the days that followed, Michael made good on his promises. He didn't just cover Margaret's medical bills, he went above and beyond, ensuring she had access to the best doctors and treatments the city could offer. Margaret was weak at first, her body still recovering from the trauma of the kidnapping and the toll her illness had taken. But with every passing day, strength began to return to her, and with it, the faint glimmer of hope that had once seemed impossible. Margaret was overwhelmed by Michael's generosity. She had never imagined that a man they had only just met could step in and change their lives so drastically. One day, as a nurse checked her vitals during a follow-up appointment, Margaret leaned toward Michael, her voice soft with disbelief. "I don't know how we'll ever repay you," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "You saved us, Michael. You gave us a second chance." Michael shook his head, dismissing the thought. "You don't owe me anything, Margaret," he replied firmly. "You and Michele deserve this, and more." Margaret opened her mouth to say something more, but the words wouldn't come. She simply nodded, grateful beyond measure, knowing that sometimes there were no words powerful enough to express what the heart felt. Meanwhile, Michele began returning to a sense of normalcy, or at least something close to it. The dark circles under her eyes slowly faded, replaced by the spark of a 13-year-old who had carried too much on her shoulders for too long. Michael ensured that Michele could go back to school, something she hadn't done in months while she worked to support her mother. The first day back, Michele stood at the front door with her backpack slung over one shoulder. Margaret, still resting on the couch, gave her daughter a weak but proud smile. "You ready?" Margaret asked, tilting her head. Michele hesitated for a moment. It felt strange, almost surreal, to be going back to something so ordinary after everything they had endured. But she nodded, determined. "Yeah, I think I am." Michael waited in the hallway, leaning casually against the doorframe. He'd insisted on driving Michele to school that day, and she didn't argue. As they made their way to the car, she glanced up at him. "Are you sure about this?" "I mean, it's just school," she said, trying to downplay her nerves. Michael gave her a reassuring smile. "It's not just school," he replied. "It's your life, Michele. And you deserve to live it." She sat quietly in the passenger seat as they drove through the familiar streets. It felt strange, comforting but strange. The weight of survival no longer pressed down on her shoulders the way it had before. Now, for the first time in a long time, she could focus on things that seemed so trivial just a few weeks ago: homework, classmates, plans for the weekend. As Michael pulled up in front of the school, Michele hesitated, her hand resting on the door handle. "Thanks," she said quietly, glancing over at him. He smiled, the kind that felt both proud and bittersweet. "Go on," he said gently. "I'll be here when school's out." Michele stepped out of the car, squaring her shoulders as she walked toward the entrance. Michael watched her go, a sense of relief settling over him. She was getting her childhood back. And that, to him, was worth everything. Back at home, Margaret's recovery continued steadily. With Michael's help, their home was transformed, every broken piece repaired, every cracked wall repainted. It wasn't just the physical space that was restored, it was the sense of safety that returned, little by little. Margaret spent more time out of bed, cooking small meals for herself and Michele, folding laundry, and reclaiming the daily routines she had lost during her illness. Her laughter, once absent for so long, slowly returned. And with each shared meal and quiet conversation, the bond between mother and daughter deepened. One afternoon, Michael stopped by their house unexpectedly, carrying a bag of groceries. He had a habit of showing up unannounced, always with something thoughtful: a new book for Michele, fresh vegetables for Margaret, or a household item they hadn't realized they needed. "You don't have to keep doing this, you know," Margaret said with a playful smile as Michael set the bag on the kitchen counter. "I know," Michael replied with a shrug. "I want to." Margaret shook her head, laughing softly. "You're impossible." Michele walked into the kitchen at that moment, eyeing the bag with curiosity. "What did you bring this time?" she asked, trying to sound unimpressed but clearly intrigued. Michael pulled out a loaf of bread, some cheese, and a carton of eggs. "Grilled cheese sandwiches," he announced. "Figured we could all use a break from serious meals." Michele grinned, her first genuine smile in days. "You're not bad at this family friend thing, you know." Michael chuckled. "I'm learning." They spent the afternoon together, making sandwiches and sharing small stories about their days. It was simple, but it felt like something precious, something that couldn't be taken for granted anymore. Later that evening, as the sun set and the house grew quiet, Margaret sat on the couch, a blanket draped over her legs. Michele leaned against her, half asleep but unwilling to leave her mother's side. Michael stood by the door, ready to leave, but something held him back. He watched them for a moment longer, Margaret running her fingers through Michelle's hair, the two of them at peace in a way that seemed almost impossible not long ago. Margaret looked up, meeting Michael's gaze. "You're staying for dinner next time," she said firmly, no room for argument. Michael smiled. "I'd like that." As he stepped out into the hallway, closing the door softly behind him, he felt something shift inside. It wasn't just relief or gratitude, it was something deeper. For the first time in a long while, Michael felt like he belonged somewhere. And for Michele and Margaret, life was beginning to feel like their own again. Not perfect, but theirs. Over the next few months, something unexpected blossomed between Michael, Margaret, and Michele, something stronger than gratitude or obligation. It wasn't just a friendship, it was the steady formation of a bond that none of them had anticipated. For Michael, whose life had been consumed by business deals, meetings, and lonely nights in an empty apartment, this connection was unlike anything he had ever known. It gave him something he hadn't realized he needed: a sense of belonging. Dinners at Margaret and Michelle's house became a ritual. At first, Michael had been hesitant, still feeling like an outsider intruding on their lives. But the way Margaret smiled warmly whenever he showed up and the way Michele teased him about his terrible cooking made him feel at home in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Soon enough, it became part of their routine. Margaret would cook simple meals: pasta, roasted vegetables, or a stew she made from memory. Michael would help with the dishes, despite Margaret's protests that he was their guest. Michele, always full of energy, would recount her day at school, her voice animated as she talked about friends and teachers. And then Mrs. Harris told Tommy he had to redo the whole assignment, Michele said one evening, laughing as she picked at the salad on her plate. He thought he could just copy from the internet. She totally caught him. Margaret smiled, watching her daughter with quiet pride. Sounds like Tommy's not the brightest bulb in the box. Michael chuckled. He sounds like someone I used to work with. Michele grinned. Do you copy your homework too? She teased. Michael shook his head. Nah. I was the kid who did everyone else's homework, for a price. Michele laughed, and even Margaret let out a soft chuckle, the sound light and genuine. It was the kind of easy joy that had been absent from their lives for far too long, but now it felt natural. After dinner, Michael stayed longer than usual, helping Michele with her math homework. She didn't need much help, she was sharp, quick with numbers, but Michael's presence seemed to comfort her, as if having him nearby made the weight of her past feel a little lighter. Margaret watched them from the kitchen, a smile playing on her lips as she dried the dishes. She hadn't seen Michele this happy in months. The shadow of fear that had once hung over their lives was slowly lifting, replaced by moments of laughter and small, meaningful routines. One Saturday afternoon, the three of them decided to take a walk through the park near the house. Michele led the way, skipping ahead as Michael and Margaret followed side by side. The crisp leaves crunched underfoot as they strolled through the winding paths, passing by joggers and families enjoying their own afternoons. Michele ran ahead to the playground, climbing onto the swings. She leaned back, letting the breeze push her forward, her laughter ringing through the air. Michael and Margaret took a seat on a nearby bench, watching her with quiet contentment. "You've been good to us," Margaret said after a moment, her voice soft but sincere. Michael shook his head slightly. "You've given me more than I've given you," he replied. "I didn't know how much I needed this until now." Margaret smiled, a warmth in her eyes that made Michael feel both seen and understood. "We're lucky to have you," she said. He didn't respond right away, just nodded. For a man who had spent so much of his life alone, this was uncharted territory, having people who cared about him, not for what he could offer, but simply for being there. After a while, Michele hopped off the swing and ran back to them, slightly breathless but grinning from ear to ear. "You guys are so slow," she teased, planting her hands on her hips. Margaret laughed. "You're too fast, that's the problem. Or maybe I'm just awesome," Michele quipped, puffing out her chest dramatically. Michael smirked. "That's definitely it." They walked together through the rest of the park, chatting about nothing in particular, just enjoying the time together. For Michael, it was the kind of day he never thought he'd have again, simple, peaceful, and full of small joys. As they reached the edge of the park, Margaret slowed her pace and turned to Michael. "You know, you don't have to leave right after dinner next time," she said casually. "We've got a perfectly good couch if you ever want to stay." Michele perked up at the idea. "Yeah, we could watch movies. Mom always falls asleep halfway through though." Margaret rolled her eyes. "I do not." Michael chuckled, feeling a strange sense of warmth spread through him. "I'll keep that in mind," he said. The invitation was simple, but it meant everything. It wasn't just an offer to crash on their couch, it was an acknowledgement that he belonged there with them. And for the first time in years, Michael allowed himself to believe that he had a place he could call home. As they strolled through the winding paths of the park, Michael slowed his steps, letting Michele skip ahead. Margaret walked beside him, her arm brushing lightly against his every now and then. The gentle rhythm of their walk, unhurried, peaceful, felt like something that had taken a long time to build. Each step was a reminder of how far they had come. Michele darted toward a bed of flowers, crouching to inspect a patch of tulips, her curiosity as lively as ever. Michael and Margaret stopped a few paces behind her. Michael shifted his gaze from Michele to Margaret, taking in the moment. He could feel it settling into his chest, this rare, quiet contentment that he hadn't known was possible. He glanced at Margaret, then back at Michele. For a man who once believed his life was destined to be spent alone, every minute with them felt like a gift he wasn't sure he deserved. But here they were, alive together, and somehow whole after everything they had been through. Michael cleared his throat, his voice low but sincere. "Thank you, for letting me be part of this." Margaret stopped, tilting her head as she looked at him. There was something soft in her gaze, a mixture of understanding and gratitude. You didn't just become part of it, Michael, she said gently. You helped us rebuild it. Before Michael could respond, Michele turned around, catching the tail end of the conversation. Her bright blue eyes lit up with her usual playful energy, but there was also a warmth behind them that hadn't always been there, a peace that came from knowing they were finally safe. We're a team, Michele said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. You're stuck with us now. Michael gave a small, genuine laugh, the kind that didn't feel forced or polite. It came from a place deep inside him. Is that so? Margaret stepped closer, slipping her arm through his. Absolutely, she said with a soft smile. Then, without hesitation, she pulled him into a gentle embrace. For a moment, Michael stood still, surprised by the warmth of it, the kind of closeness he hadn't experienced in so long. Slowly, he wrapped his arms around her, letting himself be fully present in that moment. Thank you, Margaret whispered into his shoulder, her voice filled with quiet emotion. For everything. Michael didn't reply. He didn't need to. The weight of her words settled into him, anchoring him in a way that felt grounding, permanent. Michele, not wanting to be left out, threw her arms around both of them, squeezing tightly. Okay, group hug, she announced, laughing. Michael chuckled, the sound rumbling in his chest as he held onto both of them, realizing how rare and precious this moment was. They stayed like that for a few seconds longer, holding on to one another as if to make up for all the times they thought they might lose everything. And in that embrace, there was a silent promise, one that didn't need words to be understood. They were going to be okay. As they pulled away, Michele grabbed Michael's hand and tugged him toward the playground. Come on. I need someone to push me on the swing, she said, already pulling him along. Michael shook his head, amused but following willingly. You're relentless, kid. Margaret trailed behind, watching them with a contented smile. There was something healing about seeing her daughter happy again, free in a way she hadn't been in so long. And seeing Michael, a man who had once carried so much of his own loneliness, blend seamlessly into their lives made her heart feel full. They reached the swings, and Michele hopped on, kicking her feet impatiently. Higher. Come on, Michael, you can do better than that. Michael laughed as he gave the swing another push. You're gonna regret this when I launch you into orbit. You wish. Michele shot back, her laughter carrying through the air. Margaret sat on a nearby bench, her hands folded in her lap, watching them. Her heart swelled with gratitude, not just for what they had survived, but for what they had gained in the process. It wasn't just that the fear was gone, it was the presence of something new, something they hadn't dared to hope for during their darkest moments: joy. Michael slowed the swing, and Michele jumped off, landing with a flourish. You're not bad, she said, pretending to assess his performance with exaggerated seriousness. High praise, Michael replied with a grin. Michele turned toward her mother and called out, Mom, your turn. Margaret shook her head, laughing. I think I'll leave the swinging to you too. Michael walked over and sat next to her on the bench, his expression relaxed in a way that felt almost foreign to him. She's something else, he said quietly, nodding toward Michele. Margaret smiled, her gaze soft. She is. And she wouldn't be here if it weren't for you. Michael exhaled, his hands resting on his knees. You both saved me too, you know. Margaret reached over and placed her hand gently over his. We saved each other. Michele ran back over, breathless and smiling, her cheeks flushed from the play. She plopped down between them on the bench, glancing back and forth between her mother and Michael. So what's next for us? Michele asked, kicking her feet lightly. Michael looked at Margaret, and for once, there was no hesitation or uncertainty in his voice. Whatever we want, he said simply. Michele grinned. Good answer. Margaret rested her hand on Michael's arm, giving it a small squeeze. We'll figure it out together. And in that moment, under the quiet hum of life going on around them, Michael felt something settle inside him, something peaceful and whole. After everything they had lost, after all the pain and fear, they had found something worth holding on to. And just like a garden blooming after a storm, hope had taken root, growing quietly but fiercely, reminding them all that new beginnings were possible. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. And together they would keep moving forward, one step, one day, one joy at a time.
If you've made it this far, then subscribe to the channel and leave a comment.